Germany, 1940s. The church bells of Dachau had been silent for months when Greta Müller first heard the rumble of Allied tanks approaching through the Bavarian countryside. She pressed herself against the barred window of the women's auxiliary barracks, her fingers gripping the cold metal as she watched dust clouds rise on the horizon. After 3 years of forced labor in the aircraft parts factory, 3 years of 12-hour shifts and meager rations, 3 years of watching friends disappear into the night for infractions as minor as speaking during work hours, the sound of approaching liberation felt too impossible to believe. At 24, Greta bore little resemblance to the university student who'd been arrested in Munich for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets with her brother's resistance group. Her once thick auburn hair had grown thin from malnutrition. Her hands were permanently stained with machine oil, and her back ached from years of hunching over assembly lines in poorly lit factory halls. But her eyes still held the spark of intelligence that had made her dangerous enough to the regime to warrant her imprisonment in this civilian labor camp, officially designated as a re-education facility for German women who had strayed from Nazi ideology. The approaching Allied forces represented the answer to prayers she had whispered in the darkness of her bunk each night. Yet the reality of liberation brought fears as complex as her hopes. What would freedom mean for women like her, German civilians who had been imprisoned by their own government, who existed in a grey area between perpetrator and victim that Allied intelligence might struggle to understand? Would the liberating soldiers see them as Nazi collaborators who deserved punishment, or as fellow victims of a totalitarian system that had brutalized its own people? Beside her at the window, Anna Hoffman clutched a faded photograph of her 2 young children, taken before her arrest for hiding Jewish neighbors in her basement. The picture was her most precious possession, smuggled into the camp and jealously guarded through countless searches and confiscations. Anna was 31, but looked older, her face gaunt and lined with worry about children she hadn't seen in 2 years. Her husband had been executed for his role in the same rescue operation that had landed her in this facility. Now she faced liberation with a mixture of desperate hope and paralyzing fear. Hope that her children were still alive, fear of what she might discover about their fate. The third woman at the window was barely 18, though Ingrid Schmidt's experiences had aged her far beyond her years. She had been sent to the labor camp for the crime of refusing to join the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the Nazi girls' organization that had been mandatory for all German youth. Her parents, devout Catholics who opposed Nazi ideology on religious grounds, had supported her resistance until their arrest and disappearance 6 months ago. Since then, Ingrid had survived on the hope that liberation would bring news of their whereabouts and the possibility of reuniting what remained of her shattered family. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, accompanied by voices speaking in what sounded like English. The women exchanged glances filled with a mixture of terror and anticipation. They had heard stories, whispered rumors that filtered through the camp about American and British treatment of civilians, Soviet behavior in the territories they occupied, French desires for revenge against any German they encountered. The uncertainty of what liberation would bring seemed almost as frightening as the certainty of their current suffering. The first American soldiers to enter the compound moved with professional caution, weapons ready but not threatening, their faces registering shock at the conditions they discovered. The women's barracks were overcrowded and unsanitary, with inadequate heating, minimal medical facilities, and evidence everywhere of systematic neglect and abuse. These were not concentration camps in the most horrific sense, but they were undeniably places where human dignity had been systematically stripped away from women whose only crimes had been thinking differently, helping the persecuted, or refusing to conform to Nazi social expectations. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, an Irish-American from Boston whose own grandmother had fled political persecution in Ireland, was among the first to enter Greta's barracks. He was 26, a veteran of the Normandy invasion who had seen enough of the war to recognize suffering when he encountered it, regardless of the nationality of those who endured it. His initial task was to secure the facility and assess the condition of the inmates. But he found himself unprepared for the complex emotions that arose when he realized these were German women who had been imprisoned by their own government. "Ladies," he said in careful German learned from a phrase, book and conversations with refugees, "you are safe now. The war is over. You are free." The words seemed to hang in the air, too momentous to be immediately comprehensible. Free. After years of regimented existence, of daily roll calls and work assignments and punishments for the smallest infractions, the concept of freedom felt abstract, almost meaningless. Greta found herself crying, not from joy, but from overwhelming confusion. What did freedom mean when everything familiar had been stripped away? Where would they go? What would they do? How could they begin to rebuild lives that had been systematically dismantled? The American medical personnel who arrived later that day provided the first concrete evidence that liberation represented genuine rather than merely symbolic freedom. Army doctors and nurses examined the women with professional thoroughness, treating malnutrition, infections, and chronic conditions that had gone unaddressed during their imprisonment. The medical care was provided without judgment or discrimination, focused entirely on addressing immediate health needs rather than making moral determinations about who deserved treatment. Dr. Sarah Goldman, a Jewish-American physician from New York whose own relatives had perished in Nazi concentration camps, found herself in the complex position of providing medical care to German women who had been victimized by the same system that had murdered her family. The professional and personal challenges were immense, but her commitment to medical ethics overcame any desire for revenge or selective compassion. "You're severely malnourished," Dr. Goldman told Greta during her examination. Speaking matter-of-factly in fluent German, "We'll start you on a carefully monitored refeeding program. Your body needs time to readjust to adequate nutrition." Greta stared at the doctor with amazement. This was a Jewish woman, a member of the group that Nazi propaganda had demonized and dehumanized, providing medical care with the same professional attention she would show any patient. The contradiction between everything Greta had been taught about Jewish people and the reality of this doctor's compassionate competence was so profound that it forced her to question other assumptions she had unconsciously accepted. "You're Jewish," Greta said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of confused recognition. "Yes," Dr. Goldman replied simply. "Does that surprise you?" Greta struggled to find words. "I was told that Jewish people were different, dangerous, but you're helping me." Dr. Goldman paused in her examination, considering how to respond to such fundamental misconceptions. "The Nazis told you many things that weren't true," she said gently. "People are people, regardless of their religion or background. Right now, you're a patient who needs medical care, and I'm a doctor who can provide it. That's all that matters." The interaction represented a microcosm of the broader re-education that liberation would bring to Germans who had been isolated from reality by years of propaganda. For women like Greta, who had been imprisoned precisely because they had questioned Nazi ideology, the process of discovering the truth about the regime's lies was both validating and traumatic. They had been right to resist, but the cost of that resistance had been enormous, and the full scope of what they had opposed was only now becoming clear. The food distribution that began immediately after liberation provided another shock to women accustomed to subsistence rations. American military kitchens prepared meals that contained more protein, vegetables, and calories than the women had seen in years. The portions were generous, the quality was good, and most importantly, the food was provided without conditions or arbitrary restrictions. Anna Hoffman found herself crying as she ate her first full meal in 2 years, not just from physical satisfaction, but from the psychological impact of being fed by people who expected nothing in return. The Nazi system had conditioned her to believe that food was a privilege to be earned through compliance and productivity. The American approach, feeding hungry people simply because they were hungry, represented a fundamentally different understanding of human worth and dignity. "Why?" she asked Sergeant O'Brien, who was supervising the meal distribution. "Why do you feed us?" "We are German. We are your enemies." Sergeant O'Brien, whose Irish Catholic upbringing had emphasized both social justice and personal responsibility, struggled to explain concepts that seemed obvious to him but were apparently revolutionary to women who had lived under totalitarian rule. "You're not our enemies," he said carefully. "You were prisoners. You were hungry. We had food. It's not complicated, but for Anna it was incredibly complicated. The simple act of being fed without earning the privilege challenged fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and human relationships that had been reinforced through years of imprisonment. If these American soldiers could provide food without demanding anything in return, what did that say about the system that had starved her for expressing moral convictions? The clothing distribution that followed provided similar revelations. The women were given clean, properly fitting garments to replace the threadbare prison uniforms that had marked their status as outcasts from German society. American Red Cross volunteers, many of them women, helped with sizing and distribution, treating the German women with the same dignity and respect they would show any refugee or displaced person. Margaret Thompson, a Red Cross volunteer from Nebraska whose son was serving with the occupation forces in Japan, found herself moved by the condition and demeanor of the German women she was helping. These were not the fanatical Nazi supporters that Allied propaganda had sometimes portrayed, but ordinary women who had suffered for their moral convictions and were now struggling to comprehend their sudden freedom. "This dress is beautiful," Ingrid said softly, running her fingers over the fabric of a simple blue cotton dress that fit her properly for the first time in years. "I had forgotten what it felt like to wear something clean." Margaret helped adjust the dress, struck by the girl's youth and the premature sadness in her eyes. "How old are you, dear?" 18, Ingrid replied. "But I feel much older." The conversation that followed revealed the complexity of German experiences during the Nazi era that Allied forces were only beginning to understand. Ingrid described her family's resistance to Nazi ideology, their refusal to participate in organizations they considered morally corrupt, and the gradual escalation of official persecution that had culminated in their arrest and separation. Her story was one of German victims of the Nazi system, people who had suffered for maintaining moral principles that aligned with Allied values, the psychological support services that American military, chaplains and social workers began providing addressed emotional and spiritual wounds that went far beyond physical deprivation. Many of the women were struggling with what would later be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor guilt, and the complex emotions that accompanied liberation from prolonged captivity. Father Patrick Murphy, an army chaplain from Philadelphia, conducted interfaith services that welcomed women regardless of their religious background or current spiritual state. His approach emphasized healing rather than judgment, recognition of suffering rather than assignment of blame, and hope for the future rather than dwelling on past mistakes or missed opportunities. "God sees your suffering," he told the gathered women during one of his first services. "Your imprisonment for doing what you believed was right is not meaningless. Your survival is not accidental. There is still work for you to do in this world." The words provided comfort to women who had begun to question whether their resistance to Nazi ideology had been worth the enormous personal cost. Father Murphy's message suggested that their suffering had meaning, that their survival carried responsibility, and that their future could be different. From their past, the process of establishing Contact with family members and friends scattered across war-torn Germany provided both hope and heartbreak for the liberated women. American military authorities worked to facilitate communication and eventual reunification. But the logistics were complicated by destroyed transportation networks, displaced populations, and the general chaos that accompanied. The collapse of German government, institutions, Anna's desperate search for information about her children became a daily obsession that American social workers tried to support with whatever resources they could provide. The Red Cross maintained databases of displaced persons and refugees, but the records were incomplete and often outdated. Each day brought the possibility of good news and the fear of confirmation that her worst fears had been realized. We found a children's home in Munich that might have records of your children, announced Lieutenant Sarah Williams, a social worker who had volunteered to help coordinate family reunification efforts. It's not definitive, but it's a lead worth pursuing. The combination of hope and terror that crossed Anna's face captured the emotional complexity that liberation brought to women who had survived by suppressing hope in order to endure daily hardship. The possibility of reuniting with her children was everything she had dreamed of, but it also meant confronting the reality of what might have happened to them during her imprisonment. The work assignments that were eventually offered to the women represented another aspect of their transition from imprisoned victims to free individuals, capable of making choices about their own lives. American occupation authorities needed German-speaking personnel to help with reconstruction efforts, translation services, and coordination with local civilian populations. The women's education, language skills, and understanding of German culture made them valuable assets in the complex process of rebuilding a functioning society. Greta found herself assigned to work with Allied intelligence officers who were trying to understand the structure and operations of the Nazi apparatus that had imprisoned her. Her experiences as both a victim of the system and an educated observer of its methods provided insights that were valuable for denazification efforts and the prosecution of war criminals. The irony was not lost on her that she was now helping the same Allied forces that had liberated her to dismantle the system that had tried to destroy her. The work provided a sense of purpose and agency that had been absent from her life for years, but it also required her to revisit traumatic experiences and confront the full scope of Nazi crimes against both German and foreign victims. "Tell me about the selection process," requested Major Robert Hayes, an intelligence officer who was documenting the operations of the facility where Greta had been imprisoned. How did they decide which women were sent to which work details? Greta's response revealed the arbitrary and often personal nature of Nazi persecution, the way that individual guards and administrators could determine life and death based on personal prejudices, momentary moods, or bureaucratic convenience, rather than consistent policy or legal procedures. Her testimony contributed to a growing understanding that Nazi totalitarianism had been characterized not just by systematic evil, but by chaotic brutality that reflected the fundamental incoherence of the entire ideological system, the educational opportunities that American occupation authorities began providing offered the women chances to rebuild intellectual and professional capabilities that had been suppressed. During their imprisonment, classes in English, democratic government, business administration, and technical skills prepared them for participation in the new Germany that was emerging from the ruins of the Nazi state. Professor James Mitchell, the same former high school teacher from Minnesota who had taught civics to German prisoners of war, found himself working with civilian women who had been imprisoned for refusing to abandon the democratic and humanitarian values he was now trying to teach. The irony was profound. These women had already demonstrated their commitment to principles that many Germans were only now learning about. You already understand democracy better than many people who have lived in democratic countries all their lives. Professor Mitchell told his German students during a discussion of constitutional rights and individual freedoms. You know what it costs to maintain these principles under pressure. Greta's participation in these classes provided validation for beliefs and values that had nearly cost her life. The American instructor was teaching concepts that she had intuitively understood years earlier, when she had risked everything to distribute anti-Nazi literature. Her imprisonment had been terrible, but it had also preserved her moral clarity in ways that might not have been possible if she had compromised her principles to avoid persecution. The question of where to live and how to rebuild their lives faced all the women as their physical health improved and their immediate survival needs were met. Some wanted to return to their original homes, if those homes still existed. Others preferred to start fresh in new locations where their past imprisonment would not define their future relationships and opportunities. A few even expressed interest in emigrating to allied countries where they might find opportunities unavailable in war-devastated Germany. The choice was both liberating and overwhelming. After years of having every aspect of their lives controlled by others, the responsibility of making fundamental decisions about their futures felt almost as frightening as it was exciting. American social workers provided counseling and practical assistance, but ultimately, each woman had to decide for herself how to use the freedom that had been returned to her. Anna's reunion with her children, when it finally occurred after months of searching and bureaucratic obstacles, provided both joy and heartbreak that captured the complex emotions of liberation. Her 7-year-old daughter barely remembered her, while her 10-year-old son had been told by foster parents that his mother was dead. The process of rebuilding relationships damaged by forced separation would take years and require patience and understanding from everyone involved. But the miracle of reunion itself, made possible by American efforts to reunite separated families, provided hope that other forms of reconstruction and healing might also be possible. The embrace between Anna and her children, witnessed by American personnel who had worked tirelessly to facilitate the meeting, demonstrated that some of the damage inflicted by totalitarian systems could be repaired through persistent effort and compassionate intervention. The marriages that began to develop between some of the liberated German women and American service members created personal bridges across the divide between former enemies that had broader implications for post-war reconciliation. These relationships were complicated by language barriers, cultural differences, and the trauma that the women carried from their imprisonment. But they also demonstrated the possibility of building new lives based on mutual respect and shared values rather than national identity or wartime allegiances. Ingrid's relationship with Corporal David Miller, a farm boy from Kansas who worked as a translator with the military government, developed slowly over months of conversations about literature, philosophy, and their hopes for the future. David's initial motivation was professional, helping German civilians navigate the complex bureaucracy of occupation, but gradually deepened into personal affection for a young woman whose moral courage and intellectual curiosity impressed him despite the language barriers and cultural differences between them. I want to understand. David told Ingrid during one of their conversations about her family's resistance to Nazi ideology. What made you willing to risk everything for your beliefs? Ingrid struggled to explain concepts that seemed obvious to her, but were apparently difficult for someone who had never lived under totalitarian rule to comprehend. When you see evil, you must oppose it, she said simply. If you don't, you become part of the evil. My parents taught me that. The conversation revealed fundamental differences between American and German experiences of the war that would influence their relationship and their understanding of each other. David had fought against Nazi armies but had never lived under Nazi rule. Ingrid had resisted Nazi ideology but had never experienced the democracy that David took for granted. Their relationship required both of them to learn about forms of courage and freedom that were foreign to their own experiences. The long-term integration of the liberated women into post-war German society proved challenging in ways that neither they nor their American liberators had initially anticipated. Many Germans who had not been imprisoned viewed the women with suspicion, questioning why they had been selected for punishment if they were truly loyal Germans. The moral clarity that had sustained them during imprisonment became a liability. In a society where many people preferred to forget their complicity or collaboration with Nazi policies, Greta's attempts to return to university life were complicated by professors and students who questioned her commitment to German identity and her right to participate in rebuilding German institutions. The intellectual and moral independence that had led to her imprisonment made her a threatening figure to people who were trying to reconstruct their own sense of identity and purpose after the collapse of everything they had believed or pretended to believe. You were imprisoned by Germans, pointed out Professor Wilhelm Braun, a literature instructor who had managed to retain his position despite his obvious enthusiasm for Nazi cultural policies. That suggests you were opposed to German interests. How can we trust you to participate in German recovery? Greta's response captured the moral complexity that liberation had brought to German society. I was imprisoned for opposing evil policies that destroyed Germany and brought shame to the German people. If that makes me untrustworthy, then perhaps you need to examine what you mean by German interests. The confrontation revealed tensions that would persist for decades in post-war Germany, between those who had actively or passively supported Nazi policies and those who had resisted at great personal cost. The liberated women found themselves in the position of having to justify their moral choices to people whose own choices during the Nazi era were far more questionable. The psychological healing that the women underwent during their first years of freedom involved processing not just the trauma of their imprisonment, but the broader trauma of discovering the full extent of Nazi crimes that had been committed in the name of the German people. The concentration camps, the genocide, the aggressive wars, all of this became known to them gradually as American denazification programs and war crimes trials revealed the systematic nature of Nazi evil. For women who had been imprisoned for opposing Nazi policies, these revelations provided validation for their resistance while also creating complex emotions about their German identity and their relationships with family, members and friends who had been complicit in or ignorant of these crimes. They had been right to resist, but the cost of being right included bearing witness to horrors that many preferred to deny or forget. Dr. Goldman, who continued to provide medical and psychological support to former prisoners, observed changes in the women that reflected their ongoing process of coming to terms with both personal and national trauma. Healing from imprisonment is complicated by healing from the knowledge of what the imprisonment represented, she noted in her reports to military medical authorities. These women must rebuild their lives while also reconstructing their understanding of the society that imprisoned them. The career paths that the women eventually pursued reflected both their pre-war interests and the perspectives that imprisonment and liberation had provided. Greta became a journalist who specialized in covering human rights issues and democratic development in post-war Germany. Her experiences as both victim and witness gave her insights into the fragility of democratic institutions and the importance of individual moral courage that informed her professional work for decades. Anna, after reuniting with her children, became involved in social work focused on helping other families separated by war and political persecution. Her own experience of loss and recovery provided credibility and empathy that made her effective in assisting others who faced similar challenges. The work was emotionally demanding, but also provided meaning and purpose that helped her process her own trauma while contributing to broader social healing. Ingrid's marriage to David Miller and eventual immigration to the United States represented one path toward building a new life free from the complications of German post-war society. In Kansas, she found acceptance and opportunities that might have been more difficult to achieve in Germany, where her past imprisonment could have continued to define her social and professional prospects. But even in America, Ingrid found herself serving as an informal ambassador for the complexity of German experiences during the Nazi era. Americans who had fought against Nazi armies were often surprised to learn about Germans who had been imprisoned by their own government for opposing Nazi policies. Her story contributed to a more nuanced understanding of World War II that recognized the diversity of German responses to totalitarian rule. The letters that the women wrote to American personnel who had participated in their liberation provided testimonies to the long-term impact of compassionate treatment during crisis situations. Years and even decades after the war, they continued to correspond with doctors, social workers, chaplains, and soldiers who had shown them kindness during their most vulnerable moments. "You saved more than my life," Greta wrote to Sergeant O'Brien in a letter sent for Christmas 1950. "You showed me that human decency could survive even the worst circumstances." That knowledge has sustained me through many difficult moments in the years since. Liberation. The correspondence reveals the lasting psychological impact of liberation experiences that went beyond immediate physical rescue to include restoration of faith in human goodness and possibility. For women who had been systematically dehumanized by their own government, the respectful treatment they received from former enemies provided evidence that their moral convictions had been correct and that a better world was possible. The children and grandchildren of these liberated women inherited stories of resistance, imprisonment, and liberation that shaped their understanding of moral responsibility and political engagement. Family narratives that emphasized the importance of opposing injustice, even at great personal cost, contributed to a generation of Germans who were more committed to democratic values and human rights than might otherwise have been the case. These family stories also provided alternative narratives to the broader German tendency to focus on German victimization, rather than German responsibility for Nazi crimes. The women who had been imprisoned for opposing Nazi policies offered their descendants examples of moral courage that demonstrated the possibility of individual resistance to systematic evil. In her final years, Greta established a small foundation that provided support for women who faced persecution for their political beliefs in various parts of the world. The Foundation's mission statement reflected lessons learned from her own experiences. Freedom requires constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice. Those who have experienced liberation have a responsibility to extend liberation to others. The story of German women's liberation in 1945 became a testament to the complexity of wartime experiences and the possibility of recovery and redemption even after profound trauma. It demonstrated that liberation involved more than military victory. It required sustained effort to address physical, psychological, and social wounds that totalitarian systems inflicted on their victims. The tears of relief, confusion, gratitude, and hope that these women shed upon liberation represented the beginning of long processes of healing and reconstruction that would continue for the rest of their lives. Their stories proved that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity could be preserved, and that compassionate treatment of victims, even when those victims belonged to enemy nations, served larger purposes of justice and reconciliation that transcended immediate military objectives. The American personnel who participated in their liberation learned lessons about the complexity of moral judgment and the importance of treating all people with basic human dignity, regardless of their national identity or wartime allegiances. These lessons influenced American approaches to subsequent conflicts and occupation situations, contributing to a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military victory and lasting peace. The rehabilitation programs that American authorities established for the liberated women went far beyond immediate medical care and basic necessities. These comprehensive programs addressed the complex challenges of reintegrating traumatized individuals into a society that was itself struggling to rebuild from the ruins of totalitarian collapse. The programs included vocational training, psychological counseling, educational opportunities, and social support systems that recognized the unique position these women occupied as German victims of German persecution. The vocational rehabilitation component proved particularly valuable for women whose professional skills had atrophied during years of forced labor in factories and work camps. Greta's background in literature and journalism required updating to reflect changes in media and publishing that had occurred during her imprisonment. American instructors provided training in modern journalistic techniques, democratic media ethics, and the role of free press in open societies. The contrast between Nazi propaganda methods and American journalistic principles was stark and enlightening. Where Nazi media had emphasized emotional manipulation, selective presentation of facts, and absolute loyalty to party ideology, American journalism stressed objectivity, verification of sources, and the journalist's responsibility to inform rather than indoctrinate the public. For Greta, who had been imprisoned for challenging official narratives, these principles provided a framework for understanding how truth could be pursued and preserved even in difficult circumstances. The language training programs offered to the women served multiple purposes beyond simple communication skills. Learning English provided access to Allied literature, philosophy, and political thought that had been banned under Nazi rule. More importantly, the process of acquiring a new language offered psychological benefits by creating cognitive pathways that were not associated with traumatic memories from their imprisonment. Anna found particular comfort in English lessons that allowed her to communicate directly with American personnel rather than relying on translators. The ability to express her gratitude, ask questions, and share her concerns in her own words provided a sense of agency and connection that had been absent during years of enforced silence and compliance. Her progress in English also opened possibilities for employment. With occupation authorities and international relief organizations, the cultural exchange programs established between the liberated women and American military personnel created opportunities for mutual understanding that went beyond official policies of denazification and democratization. These informal relationships allowed Americans to learn about the complexity of German resistance to Nazi rule while providing German women with first-hand exposure to democratic values and practices. Sergeant O'Brien organized weekly discussion groups where German women could practice English while sharing their experiences and perspectives with American soldiers. These sessions often became emotional as participants processed the trauma of war from different viewpoints. American soldiers learned that not all Germans had supported Nazi policies, while German women discovered that their former enemies were often motivated by humanitarian rather than purely military concerns. The discussions revealed common ground in shared values of family, faith, and human dignity that transcended national boundaries. Young German women spoke of missing parents and siblings, while American soldiers shared photographs of families back home. Veterans on both sides described the horror of combat and their relief that the fighting had finally ended. These personal connections created bonds that would influence both groups' understanding of international relations for decades to come. The medical follow-up care provided to the liberated women established new standards for treating trauma survivors that would influence psychiatric and social work practices well beyond the immediate post-war period. Dr. Goldman and her colleagues documented the psychological effects of prolonged imprisonment, systematic dehumanization, and forced separation from family members. Their research contributed to early understanding of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The treatment approach emphasized restoring agency and choice to women who had been denied control over the most basic aspects of their lives for years. Rather than imposing treatment regimens, medical personnel worked with patients to develop individualized recovery plans that respected their preferences, cultural backgrounds, and personal goals. This collaborative approach helped rebuild the sense of personal autonomy that totalitarian systems had systematically destroyed. Regular psychological assessments tracked the women's progress in recovering from trauma while identifying ongoing challenges that required attention. Many struggled with survivor guilt, questioning why they had lived while others had perished. Others experienced anxiety about making decisions after years of having every choice made for them. Some dealt with intense anger toward the German society that had allowed their persecution to occur. The group therapy sessions that Dr. Goldman organized provided opportunities for the women to process these complex emotions with others who had shared similar experiences. The sessions revealed patterns of trauma and recovery that helped medical personnel develop more effective treatment approaches. They also created support networks among the survivors that would continue long after formal treatment ended. The religious and spiritual support services addressed needs that went beyond psychological healing to encompass questions of meaning, purpose, and moral framework that imprisonment had raised for many of the women. Father Murphy's interfaith approach welcomed women, regardless of their religious background, while acknowledging that spiritual questions often became more urgent rather than less important during times of extreme hardship. Many of the women struggled with questions about divine justice, wondering why they had suffered for doing what they believed was right, while others had prospered through collaboration or indifference. Others questioned whether their survival carried special obligations, or whether they were free to simply rebuild normal lives. These spiritual concerns required careful attention from chaplains trained in trauma, counseling, as well as theology. The prayer and meditation groups that formed spontaneously among the women provided additional support for spiritual healing. These groups were ecumenical, including Catholics, Protestants, and women with more secular spiritual orientations. The shared practice of prayer and reflection created bonds that transcended denominational differences while providing structure for processing grief, gratitude, and hope. The legal assistance programs helped the women navigate complex questions about their status, rights, and options in post-war Germany. Many faced property disputes involving homes and possessions that had been confiscated during their imprisonment. Others needed help understanding their eligibility for compensation, benefits, or official recognition as victims of political persecution. The legal challenges were complicated by the collapse of German governmental institutions and the uncertain status of laws and regulations that had been enacted under Nazi rule. American military lawyers worked with German legal experts to establish frameworks for addressing these issues fairly while avoiding the chaos that could result from wholesale invalidation of all wartime legal proceedings. Some women faced particular challenges related to their family situations. Anna's children had been placed in Nazi-approved foster homes after their parents' arrest, and the legal process of regaining custody required careful navigation of both American occupation policies and traditional German family law. The complexity of these cases highlighted the far-reaching effects of totalitarian systems on civilian populations. The documentation and testimony programs established by Allied authorities served multiple purposes in helping the liberated women process their experiences while contributing to historical understanding and legal proceedings against war criminals. The women's detailed accounts of their treatment provided evidence for prosecutions, while also creating permanent records of Nazi persecution of German civilians. The testimony process was emotionally difficult, but ultimately therapeutic for many of the women. The opportunity to have their experiences officially recognized and recorded provided validation that their suffering had been real and meaningful. The knowledge that their testimony might prevent similar atrocities in the future gave purpose to memories that might otherwise have remained sources of only pain and bitterness. Greta's detailed account of the arbitrary nature of punishment in her labor camp contributed to legal cases against administrators who had abused their authority. Her testimony revealed patterns of corruption, sexual harassment, and violent intimidation that went beyond official policies to reflect the personal sadism of individual guards and supervisors. The historical research programs that began during the occupation period created opportunities for liberated women to contribute to scholarly understanding of Nazi totalitarianism while processing their own experiences through academic analysis. Universities in America and Britain established research projects that collected oral histories from German resistance members and persecution victims. Anna participated in several research projects that documented the experience of Germans who had helped Jewish refugees despite the enormous risks involved. Her interviews with historians and social scientists helped establish the factual record of German assistance to persecuted minorities, while also providing her with frameworks for understanding her own actions and their historical significance. The academic attention validated the moral choices that had led to her imprisonment, while placing them in broader contexts of human rights and resistance to tyranny. The recognition that her actions had been part of a larger pattern of German opposition to Nazi persecution policies helped counter narratives that portrayed all Germans as either perpetrators or passive bystanders. The employment assistance programs developed by American authorities recognized that economic independence would be crucial for the women's successful reintegration into civilian life. These programs went beyond simple job placement to include skills assessment, career counseling and training opportunities designed to maximize each woman's potential for self-sufficiency and professional satisfaction. The programs also addressed unique challenges faced by women whose imprisonment had interrupted their career development during crucial years. Greta had been arrested during her university studies, leaving her without completed credentials or professional experience. Enna had been a homemaker before her arrest, with limited work experience outside domestic contexts. Ingrid had been imprisoned before she could begin any career training. American employment specialists worked with each woman to identify transferable skills, educational deficits, and career interests that could guide their rehabilitation programs. The approach was individualized, recognizing that each woman's path to independence would be different based on her background, interests, and post-war circumstances. The small business development programs established specifically for persecution victims provided opportunities for entrepreneurship that could offer both economic independence and personal fulfillment. These programs included training in business planning, access to startup capital, and ongoing mentorship from successful American and German business owners. Several of the liberated women established small enterprises that drew on skills and interests they had developed before or during their imprisonment. One former teacher opened a tutoring service that helped German children adapt to reformed educational curricula. Another woman with sewing skills established a tailoring business that served both German civilians and American occupation personnel. The success of these small businesses provided models for other persecution victims while contributing to the broader economic recovery of German communities. The businesses also served as informal gathering places where survivors could maintain social connections and provide mutual support as they rebuilt their lives. The housing assistance programs addressed immediate needs for safe, stable accommodation, while recognizing that housing choices could significantly impact psychological recovery and social reintegration. Many of the women's former homes had been destroyed, confiscated, or occupied by other families during their imprisonment, creating complex legal and practical challenges. American authorities established temporary housing facilities specifically for liberated political prisoners, providing safe environments where women could recover from trauma without facing immediate pressure to integrate into German communities that might view them with suspicion or hostility. These facilities offered privacy, security, and access to support services, while women made decisions about their long-term living arrangements. The temporary housing also provided opportunities for the women to form supportive communities with others who had shared similar experiences. These relationships often became lifelong friendships that provided ongoing emotional support through the challenges of post-war adjustment and integration. The family reunification services expanded beyond simply locating missing relatives to include counseling and support for the complex process of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by forced separation. The services recognized that reunification, while desperately desired, could also be emotionally challenging for all parties involved. Children who had been separated from imprisoned parents often struggled to reconnect with adults they barely remembered or had been told were dead. Parents faced grief over years of their children's lives they had missed, along with anxiety about their ability to resume parental roles after traumatic experiences. Siblings dealt with guilt about their different wartime experiences and uncertainty about how to relate to family members who had suffered in ways they could not fully understand. The counseling services provided guidance for navigating these complex emotional dynamics while rebuilding family relationships on new foundations. The process required patience, understanding, and professional support that recognized the unique challenges faced by families torn apart by political persecution. Anna's reunion with her children required months of careful preparation and ongoing counseling support. Her 7-year-old daughter had no memory of her mother and initially resisted attempts to establish a relationship. Her 10-year-old son remembered his mother but had been told she was a criminal who had betrayed Germany by helping enemies of the state. The process of rebuilding their relationship required Anna to explain complex political and moral concepts to children who had been indoctrinated with Nazi ideology during their formative years. American social workers provided guidance on how to address these challenges, while child psychologists helped the children process conflicted emotions about their mother's imprisonment and their own wartime experiences. The educational reform programs that American authorities implemented in post-war Germany created opportunities for the liberated women to contribute to the reconstruction of German educational systems based on democratic rather than totalitarian principles. Many of the women had educational backgrounds that made them valuable participants in curriculum development, teacher training, and educational administration. The programs recognized that democratic education required more than simply removing Nazi content from existing curricula. It demanded fundamental changes in teaching methods, classroom relationships, and educational objectives that emphasized critical thinking, individual development, and democratic citizenship rather than conformity and obedience to authority. Greta's background in literature and her experience as a victim of Nazi persecution made her particularly valuable in developing new approaches to teaching German history and literature that acknowledged the complexity of the Nazi period while promoting democratic values. Her work on textbook revision committees helped ensure that future generations of German students would learn accurate information about Nazi crimes and German resistance. The teacher training programs established by occupation authorities provided opportunities for persecution victims to share their experiences with educators who would be responsible for teaching about the Nazi period. These programs help teachers understand the human impact of totalitarian policies, while providing frameworks for discussing difficult historical topics with sensitivity and accuracy. The cultural reconstruction efforts that began during the occupation period provided opportunities for the liberated women to participate in rebuilding German cultural institutions based on principles of artistic freedom and intellectual independence rather than political conformity. These efforts recognized that cultural life had been severely damaged by Nazi policies that had restricted artistic expression and eliminated cultural diversity. The program supported the revival of artistic and intellectual traditions that had been suppressed under Nazi rule, while encouraging new forms of cultural expression that reflected democratic values and international perspectives. Museums, libraries, theaters, and concert halls were rebuilt with support from Allied authorities and input from German cultural leaders who had maintained their integrity during the Nazi period. Several of the liberated women became involved in these cultural reconstruction efforts, contributing their experiences and perspectives to institutions that would shape post-war German identity. Their participation helped ensure that German cultural institutions would remember and acknowledge the persecution of Germans who had opposed Nazi policies. The international exchange programs that developed during the post-war period provided opportunities for some of the liberated women to travel abroad, sharing their experiences with international audiences while learning about democratic societies in other countries. These exchanges served educational purposes for both the German participants and their international hosts. Ingrid's eventual immigration to the United States through marriage to an American soldier represented one form of international exchange that had lasting impact on American understanding of German experiences during the Nazi period. Her presence in American communities provided personal testimony about the complexity of German responses to totalitarian rule. The research collaborations that developed between German survivors and international scholars contributed to academic understanding of totalitarianism, resistance, and trauma recovery that influenced policies and practices well beyond the immediate post-war period. These collaborations helped establish fields of study that would become increasingly important during the Cold War and subsequent international conflicts. The legacy of the liberation and rehabilitation programs extended far beyond the immediate post-war period to influence American and international approaches to humanitarian intervention, post-conflict reconstruction, and trauma recovery. The lessons learned from working with German political prisoners informed policies for dealing with refugees, displaced persons, and persecution victims in subsequent international crises. The documentation of successful rehabilitation techniques contributed to the development of professional standards and training programs for social workers, psychologists, and medical personnel who would work with trauma survivors in various contexts. The emphasis on restoring agency and choice to victims became a central principle in trauma treatment approaches. The recognition that liberation involved more than military victory, that it required sustained effort to address physical, psychological, and social wounds inflicted by totalitarian systems, influenced American foreign policy approaches to post-conflict situations throughout the Cold War and beyond. The understanding that former enemies could become allies when treated with dignity and respect became a cornerstone of American diplomatic strategy. The personal relationships that developed between American personnel and German survivors created lasting bonds that influenced both groups' understanding of international relations and human rights. Many American veterans remained in contact with German women they had helped liberate. Following their progress through decades of recovery and reconstruction, these relationships provided American participants with ongoing education about the long-term effects of their wartime service, while giving German survivors connections to America that would influence their perspectives on international affairs and democratic development. The personal dimension of these relationships humanized abstract concepts of reconciliation and international cooperation. The children and grandchildren of the liberated women inherited not only stories of persecution and liberation, but also examples of international cooperation and human compassion that shaped their worldviews and political commitments. Many became advocates for human rights, democratic development, and international understanding based on family histories that demonstrated both the dangers of totalitarianism and the possibilities for recovery through compassionate intervention. The family narratives that emphasized the importance of maintaining moral principles, even under extreme pressure, contributed to generations of Germans who were more resistant to authoritarian appeals and more committed to democratic institutions. The stories also provided counter-narratives to broader German tendencies to focus on German victimization rather than German responsibility for Nazi crimes. The memoirs, oral histories, and documentary projects that the liberated women participated in during their later years created permanent records of their experiences that would continue to educate future generations about the complexity of the Nazi period and the importance of protecting human rights and democratic institutions. These records also provided valuable resources for researchers studying totalitarianism, resistance, trauma recovery, and post-conflict reconstruction. The detailed accounts of persecution, liberation, and rehabilitation contributed to scholarly understanding of these phenomena while preserving individual stories that illustrated the human dimensions of historical events. The foundations and charitable organizations that some of the liberated women established during their later years extended their legacy of survival and recovery by supporting others who faced persecution or trauma in various contexts. These organizations applied lessons learned from their own experiences to help refugees, political prisoners, and other vulnerable populations. Greta's Foundation for Supporting Persecuted Women Around the World reflected her understanding that the principles that had led to her imprisonment and the compassion that had enabled her recovery were relevant to contemporary struggles for human rights and dignity. The Foundation's work demonstrated that the experience of being a victim could be transformed into a source of strength and wisdom that could benefit others. The liberation of German women who had been imprisoned by their own government for moral convictions that aligned with Allied values demonstrated that the line between victim and perpetrator, enemy and ally, was often more complex than wartime propaganda suggested. Their recovery and integration into post-war society proved that redemption was possible even for those who belonged to defeated nations, provided they were treated with justice, compassion, and respect for their human dignity. The comprehensive rehabilitation programs developed for these women established models for post-conflict reconstruction that recognized the complexity of trauma recovery and the importance of addressing not only immediate physical needs but also psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of healing. These programs demonstrated that successful liberation required sustained effort and resources that went far beyond military victory to encompass the long-term work of rebuilding human lives and social institutions. The success of these rehabilitation efforts provided evidence that former enemies could indeed become allies when treated with dignity and offered genuine opportunities for recovery and growth. The transformation of German political prisoners into productive citizens of democratic societies proved that human beings possessed remarkable capacities for resilience and renewal when supported by institutions and individuals committed to humanitarian values. The lasting impact of these liberation and rehabilitation experiences extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence international understanding of human rights, post-conflict reconstruction, and the relationship between military victory and lasting peace. The lessons learned from these programs continued to inform humanitarian interventions and reconstruction efforts for decades, demonstrating that the compassionate treatment of victims and former enemies could serve both moral and practical purposes in building a more stable and just world order.